In 1963, a man in central Turkey knocked down a wall in his basement and found a tunnel that dropped 18 floors straight into the earth, into a hidden city built to hide 20,000 people. 40 miles of that region is still unmapped, and nobody alive knows who first started digging. Across the same country, there's a mountain crowned with giant stone heads torn from the bodies of gods, guarding a king's tomb that has defeated every archaeologist for over a century. These places are real, photographed, archived with case numbers, and every one of them breaks the version of history they taught you in school. Join us, and let's discover the objects that rewrite human history. Let's go.
Number 13. Yanar Taş. Flames come straight out of bare rock on the mountainside above Turkey's Lycian coast, and they have never gone out. No fire pit, no fuel tank, no torch left burning. Dozens of small fires push up through cracks in the limestone, some flickering in the wind, others standing dead still like candles on an altar. Locals call it Yanar Taş, the burning stone. The ancient Greeks called it the Chimera, the exact spot tied to the myth of the fire-breathing monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. In the old texts, this was not a bedtime creature. It was a fixed point on the map, and it is still burning today. Geochemists say the flames come from methane and heavier gases seeping up through the rock, which is true, but skips the real question. Why has it burned without a single interruption for at least 2,500 years, and likely far longer? Centuries ago, the fire stood nearly 2 meters tall, high enough to be seen from ships at sea, working as a natural lighthouse for thousands of years with zero maintenance and zero fuel anyone ever had to carry up the slope. The Greeks said this was the forge of Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, hammering weapons in the belly of the mountain. Strip away the tourists and the railings, stand here in the dark 2,000 years ago, and you would have called it something divine too. The mountain keeps burning. It just stopped telling anyone why.
Number 12. Termessos. In 334 BCE, the man who would conquer half the known world took one look at this place and walked away. Alexander the Great was marching through Asia Minor, and nothing could stop him. Granicus, Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus. Cities surrendered before he reached their walls. Then he came to Termessos, perched in a mountain gorge above 1,100 meters, studied it, and decided it was not worth the fight. It is the only episode like it in his entire campaign through the region, and it became one of the most unexplained pauses in his career. The city was built by the Pisidians, whom the geographer Strabo called unconquerable highlanders, who bowed to no foreign ruler and no foreign god. They backed it up, resisting Persians, Greeks, and later Romans, holding their independence longer than almost anyone in Anatolia. Today, the theater, the agora, the cisterns, all stand nearly untouched, because the city was never sacked or burned. It simply emptied out over centuries, until only silence and stone were left on the peak. And among the thousands of tombs scattered across the slopes sits one that should not exist here. It belongs to a general from Alexander's own army, buried by the very people his commander could not break. The first systematic excavation of that necropolis only began in February 2026. Until then, more than 3,000 tombs and around 900 inscriptions sat unread, waiting on the mountain Alexander refused to climb.
Only 1% of people know the dark truth behind what we are about to show you next. If you want to be part of the few who actually know what's happening in the world, subscribe and leave a like right now. Done? Look at this.
Number 11. The Phrygian Valley Roads. Cut into solid volcanic rock in central Turkey are deep parallel grooves that run for kilometers across the plateau. Not wagon ruts pressed into soft mud, but channels carved into hard stone, some shallow, some nearly 2 meters deep. They run straight, they branch, they cross, forming complex knots in the bedrock. The gap between each pair is about 110 centimeters, matching the axle width of ancient carts, which sounds ordinary until the dating arrives. Researchers estimate some sections were formed thousands of years before the wheel was a heavy load-bearing machine, back when it was barely an idea spreading between cultures, nowhere near capable of slicing 2-meter trenches into volcanic rock. Mainstream science says the depth built up gradually over countless generations of traffic, the same route worn deeper and deeper. Reasonable, except for the detail it cannot explain. Some of the grooves run straight to the edge of a cliff and simply stop. The road ends over open air, as if it once led somewhere that no longer exists, the destination gone while the path remained. Russian researcher Alexander Koltipin spent over a decade insisting the tracks match no known transport technology of their era, that whatever cut them was heavier and stranger than any cart or chariot in the record. Real archaeologists disagree with his conclusions, and the dating is hotly contested. But nobody has fully explained the roads that drive off the edge of the world.
Number 10. Çatalhöyük. 8,500 years ago, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people lived packed into a single settlement in south-central Turkey, a megacity by the standards of its age. There were no streets. Houses were built wall to wall with no gaps and no doors. You entered through a hole in the roof, climbed down a ladder, and got around town by walking across the rooftops like a sidewalk in the sky. Below your feet, families lived, cooked, and buried their dead, not in a cemetery outside the walls, but directly under the floor, beside the hearth, under the sleeping platform. That alone wrecks the picture of the simple cave-dwelling primitive. Then, in 2020, researchers found something that finishes the job. A young man's skull, around 18 or 19 years old, with a perfectly round hole, 2.5 centimeters wide, drilled into it. The edges were smoothed, and the bone around the opening shows clear signs of healing. The man survived the surgery. Skull surgery, 8,000 years ago, with no metal tools, no anesthesia, no operating room. The first clearly documented surgical instruments appear roughly 3,000 years after this man already lay under someone's hands with a hole bored through his head and lived long enough for the bone to start fusing shut. And less than 1/10 of the city has been dug. Almost the entire place is still down there, holding skulls nobody has counted.
Number 9. The Çatalhöyük Map. A British archaeologist published the first finds from Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, wall paintings and figurines, and a ritual life far richer than anyone expected. And it made him famous before it ruined him. In 1966, he was barred from the site over accusations of involvement in antiquity smuggling. The charges were disputed, and some colleagues believed they came out of academic infighting rather than evidence. What is certain is that after he was removed, the excavation froze for nearly 30 years. Among the images he recorded was one that still unsettles researchers, a painting many describe as a map. Not a vague scribble of territory, but a layout of the town's boxy rooftops with a twin-peaked volcano erupting in the background, one that matches the real volcano Hasan Dağı about 140 kilometers away. If that reading holds, this is the oldest landscape map on Earth, painted 8,000 years ago by people who, by every textbook, were not supposed to think in those terms yet. Some experts push back hard, arguing the pattern is just decorative, leopard skin, or abstract geometry, not a map at all. The argument has never been settled, but somebody stood in front of that wall 8 millennia ago and painted shapes that line up, far too neatly, with a mountain you can still drive to today.
Number 8. Mount Nemrut. Giant stone heads lie scattered across a mountaintop in southeastern Turkey, ripped from the bodies of the gods they belong to. Each one stands taller than a person, faces frozen in calm stares, eagles and lions among them, all decapitated and abandoned to the wind at over 2,100 meters. A king named Antiochus I built this in the 1st century BCE, a sanctuary where Greek and Persian gods merged into hybrid deities, and he seated himself among them as an equal, reaching for immortality. Behind the statues rises a 50-meter mound of crushed rock, an artificial peak the king piled onto the summit, and underneath it is supposed to lie his tomb.
For over 140 years, archaeologists have tried to reach it and failed. A German engineer reported the site in 1881. An American archaeologist named Teresa Gell spent decades of her life tunneling through the slopes searching for the burial chamber and never found it. The mound itself is the trap. It is built from millions of loose stones, so any tunnel dug into it collapses and fills back in, sealing the king deeper with every attempt. Modern teams now scan it without digging, unwilling to risk the avalanche. Somewhere under that pile, a man who declared himself a god has been waiting in the dark for 2,000 years, and the mountain has refused to give him up.
Number 7. Derinkuyu. A man renovating his home in 1963 swung a hammer through a basement wall and uncovered a passage that fell away into darkness. Below it sat a city carved 85 meters straight down into the volcanic rock, 18 levels deep, large enough to shelter 20,000 people along with their livestock and food. Derinkuyu had everything a city needs hidden underground: stables, kitchens, wineries, chapels, schools, wells, and a ventilation system with over 50 shafts that kept fresh air flowing to the lowest floor. The defenses are the chilling part. Massive circular stone doors, some weighing half a ton, could be rolled across the corridors and locked from the inside only, sealing each level off independently, so an invader who breached one floor still could not reach the next. The tunnels were cut narrow on purpose, forcing attackers to crawl through single file into kill zones. The Phrygians likely started it nearly 3,000 years ago, and later inhabitants drove it deeper, vanishing underground for months whenever armies swept across the surface above them. Cappadocia hides more than 200 of these underground cities, and only a fraction have been mapped. Derinkuyu was even connected to another buried city kilometers away through a tunnel long enough to walk between them without ever surfacing. What were they hiding from that made them dig a metropolis into the earth?
Number 6. The Karahantepe storytelling figurines. 3 tiny stone animals, each barely 3.5 centimeters tall, turned out to be the oldest story ever told. Archaeologists at Karahantepe in southeastern Turkey found them in 2025. A fox, a vulture, and a wild boar, carved with care, and then deliberately arranged inside a small vessel, sealed with a stone lid, and tucked into a larger container packed with red sterile soil. The placement was not random. Each figure was positioned to play a role, frozen mid-scene, which makes this the earliest known three-dimensional narrative in human history. A story acted out in carved stone roughly 11,500 years ago. The head excavator believes these animals carried specific meanings inside a mythology that is now completely lost. A tale everyone in that community would have recognized, the way we recognize a famous fairy tale, told and retold by storytellers who kept it alive long enough for someone to carve it into permanence. Around the same site, archaeologists pulled up wolf jaws, leopard bones, beads, and carved batons, an entire symbolic world buried on purpose. We are staring at the punchline of a joke, or the climax of a legend told before farming, before writing, before cities, and the meaning is gone forever. We can see that it was a story. We will never know what it said.
Number 5. The Kalisic statue. Workers pulled an 80-centimeter block of limestone out of the ground in 1965, drove it to a museum, gave it an archive number, and let it sit on a shelf for 40 years while almost nobody looked at it. Then, archaeologists started digging the stone hills nearby. The context changed, and that forgotten lump became one of the most disturbing objects in the country. It is 11,000 years old, one of the oldest three-dimensional depictions of a human ever found, except it barely looks human. The body is strangely short, the arms little more than scratches, and the head is enormous and flattened into a horizontal T-shaped profile that exists in no known human canon from the period. The profile does not read like an attempt to carve a face or a skull. It reads like something else entirely. Researchers who saw it for the first time struggled to describe their reaction in academic language, the sense that you are not looking at an image of a person, but at an image of someone else that a human tried to give a shape to. The same T-shaped head appears on the giant pillars at Göbekli Tepe a few kilometers away, which means this was not one sculptor's mistake. It was an entire visual language, repeated across sites, depicting a being whose true face we no longer have a word for.
Deep inside a chamber carved straight into the bedrock at Karahantepe, a life-sized human head juts out of the wall, neck and all, staring across a room that was cut into the living rock 11,000 years ago. It was not placed there. It was sculpted as part of the wall itself, a face being born out of the stone. Below it runs a row of tall carved pillars shaped unmistakably like phalluses, leading toward the watching head in what archaeologists read as a staged ritual procession, a path you were meant to walk while something in the rock looked back at you. These people had no pottery, no metal, no writing, and by the textbook, no agriculture, yet they were quarrying, carving, and engineering ritual architecture out of solid bedrock. The whole chamber appears to have been deliberately filled in and sealed by the same hands that built it, buried on purpose, as if whatever happened in that room was meant to be closed forever. And Karahantepe is only one hill among many. The locals call the cluster Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills, and every new mound dug exposes more pillars, more carvings, more sealed rooms. In February 2026, they uncovered what may be the oldest staircase on Earth here. The hill keeps producing impossibilities faster than anyone can explain the last one.
Number 3. The Taş Tepeler DNA connection. In 2025, scientists cracked open the first genome ever sequenced from ancient Egypt, a man who lived around 4,800 years ago near the dawn of the pharaohs, and the result detonated a quiet bomb. Roughly a fifth of his ancestry traced straight back to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, to Mesopotamia and the highlands of southeastern Turkey, the exact region where Göbekli Tepe and Karahantepe stand. The Neolithic sites used to anchor that genetic comparison, places like Çayonu and Boncuklu Tarla, grew directly out of the Taş Tepeler tradition, the same cultural world that raised those impossible carved pillars. Read that slowly. The builders of the oldest monuments on the planet, the people who carved storytelling animals and sealed chambers into bedrock 11,000 years ago, carried genetic threads that surface again thousands of years later in the blood of a man buried near the rise of the pyramids. The link runs from the stone hills of Anatolia to the sands of Egypt. Scientists are careful with what they will say out loud, framing it as ancient migration across the Fertile Crescent, which it almost certainly was. But the thread is real, it is published, and it ties the first monument builders to the civilization that would one day raise tombs for god-kings. The question of what traveled along that thread is now on the table, and it cannot be taken back.
Number 2. Göbekli Tepe. Bury everything you think you know about where civilization began, and start with one number: 12,000 years. That is the age of the Great Stone Rings at Göbekli Tepe, predating Stonehenge by about 6,000 years, and the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 7,000. The builders raised T-shaped megalithic pillars, the heaviest weighing as much as a loaded semi-truck, stood them in massive circles, and covered them in carved snakes, foxes, scorpions, cranes, and human arms, so detailed you can name the species. Then, at some point, they deliberately buried the entire complex under tons of earth, which is the only reason it survived intact for us to find. The problem for the timeline is brutal. These people had no pottery, no metal, no writing, and supposedly no farming. The textbook says you need agriculture and stored surplus food to free up the labor for monuments like this. Göbekli Tepe says the monument may have come first, and farming followed, flipping the entire accepted story of how civilization started on its head. Wild wheat, first domesticated anywhere on Earth, grows on a mountain barely 30 kilometers from the site. And after decades of work,
Less than a tenth of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. 16 more stone rings sit untouched under the hill, mapped by radar, waiting. The oldest temple on the planet is mostly still buried, and what it is hiding could be worse than what it already showed us.
The Vulture Stone. One pillar at Göbekli Tepe carries a panel that a team of engineers believes records the exact day the world nearly ended. A vulture spreads its wings, and balanced on one wingtip sits a round disc. Below and around it crowd a scorpion, a wounded bird, and a headless human figure. Researchers led by an engineer at the University of Edinburgh argued that these animals are not decoration, but constellations, a frozen star map, and that the carving marks a catastrophic comet strike around 10,950 BCE, an impact some link to a sudden plunge back into Ice Age cold that lasted over 1,000 years. Mainstream archaeologists push back hard, calling the reading speculative and the dating shaky, and the debate has never been resolved. But sit with what the stone actually shows: a headless body, a bird of death, a disc in the sky, carved into rock by people who, according to everything we were taught, had no writing, no astronomy, and no reason to be tracking the heavens at all. Whatever they saw, whatever happened in that sky above the stone hills, they considered it important enough to spend generations cutting it into a pillar, so that someone, 12,000 years later, would stand in front of it and finally try to read the warning. We are the ones they were carving it for, and we still cannot agree on what it says.
If you thought this was terrifying, you are not ready for what they found in the video on your screen. Click it right now. The truth is worse than you think.